Charles II of England, the so-called Merry Monarch, had a legendary love life. His mistresses were visible, integral members of his court. Stories of their affairs with the king, and their rivalries with each other, have echoed through the centuries. Born in 1630, Charles spent much of his young adulthood in exile. His father, Charles I, was ousted from the throne and executed in 1649. While a puritanical regime ruled over England, Charles bided his time on the continent. In 1661, England's Parliament invited Charles to come home and become king. This restoration of the monarchy ushered in a new phase in English history. Charles had some accomplishments during his 25 years on the throne. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, opening theatres in London and sponsoring the Royal Society for Scientific Study. But Charles is best remembered for a love life that was even crazier than Henry VIII's. While, like Charles, Henry had several mistresses, it was his multiple marriages that brought him infamy. Henry ended his marriages as quickly as he rushed into them. He was as likely to divorce a wife as execute one. Much of Henry's bedroom politics increasingly focused on his desire to produce a male heir, though his poor health slowed him down in his later years. If Henry VIII's love life was deadly, Charles II's was bawdy. He never let marriage get in the way of a good affair. A prolific adulterer, Charles freely engaged in colorful, public liaisons with a string of women. These mistresses came from all kinds of backgrounds and were well known by courtiers and commoners alike. They were often at the center of court politics and managed intrigues of their own. Welcome back to History Rediscovered. In this episode, we discuss the crazy love and intimate life of Charles II of England. Enjoy! He never fathered a legitimate child but had over a dozen illegitimate ones. Though Charles was married to Catherine of Braganza, the marriage never produced any children. Much to her dismay, Catherine had several pregnancies that ended in miscarriage. Charles fathered several illegitimate children, however. Though historians quibble on the exact number, he may have had 16 or more. Charles financially supported and doted upon them. Charles' lack of legitimate heirs meant that his younger brother James succeeded him to the throne in 1685. One mistress was a French spy Charles nicknamed Phoebus. Born into the French nobility, Louise de Keroualle first came to England in 1670 as part of Charles II's sister's entourage. Charles soon became infatuated with her and installed her as his mistress. Like many of Charles's other mistresses, Louise understood that her relationship with the king was ultimately political. In fact, she was a French spy. She was part of a direct line of information, via the French ambassador, to King Louis XIV of France. By all accounts, Charles was genuinely attached to Louise and admitted, "'Tis impossible to express the true passion and kindness I have for my dearest Phoebus." Phoebus was his term of endearment for her. Louise stayed by Charles' side until his passing. Charles had a servant who was known as his pimp master. As the King of England and Scotland, Charles II had a servant for everything, even for procuring female company. William Chiffinch was officially in charge of Charles' bedroom. Informally, however, he was known as the King's Pimp Master General. Chiffinch recruited potential mistresses for Charles. He didn't just recruit well-connected noblewomen, he also recruited women from all walks of life in London. Barbara Palmer, nicknamed the Uncrowned Queen, insisted on birthing Charles' illegitimate child in a palace. One of Charles's most controversial mistresses was Barbara Palmer, the Duchess of Cleveland and the Countess of Castlemaine, who adored all the trappings, wealth, and privileges that came with her position. Nicknamed the Uncrowned Queen, Palmer wasn't above throwing her weight around court. When Charles married Catherine of Braganza in 1662, Palmer displayed her undergarments at Whitehall Palace. According to historic royal palaces, this move demonstrated how Palmer was not only objecting to the marriage but making a claim of ownership over Charles and the court. Parma went out of her way to assert her authority. When Parma gave birth to one of Charles's illegitimate children, she insisted on doing so at Hampton Court Palace, one of the royal estates. Many resented Barbara Parma's influence over Charles. According to court diarist Samuel Pepys, Parma rules him, who, he says, hath all the tricks of art in that are to be practiced to give pleasure. Nell Gwyn once outmaneuvered a rival mistress by slipping her a laxative. Charles II often maintained several mistresses at once. This sometimes stoked rivalries between them as they tried to outmaneuver one another for the king's attention and favor. One story claims that Nell Gwyn went to extreme lengths to prevent Charles from seeing Moll Davis, another royal mistress. Before Davis was supposed to have a rendezvous with the king, Gwyn added a laxative to Davis's meal, thus making her indisposed for the remainder of the night. Charles' first lover may have been his former nurse. Charles was 14 years old when he may have taken his first lover, Christabella Wyndham. Wyndham wasn't just any lady of the court, she had an intimate connection with Charles. She had served as his nurse when he was a baby. The fact that Wyndham had nursed the young prince did not seem to dissuade the couple, however. He had a thing for actresses. When Charles II came to the throne in 1660, he reopened theatres that had been closed since 1642. The revival of English theatres also brought something new: professional actresses who had previously been banned from performing on stage. At least two of Charles's mistresses were actresses. As a stage performer, Nell Gwyn was already well known before she became a royal mistress. Charles' affair with Moll Davis, pictured at right, another actress, brought her considerable wealth too. Charles bullied his wife into accepting his mistress. In 1662, Charles married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess. Unfortunately for Catherine, Charles was already several years into an affair with Barbara Parma, Lady Castlemaine. Charles was so devoted to Parma that he once quipped, "Whosoever I find to be my Lady Castlemaine's enemy, I do promise upon my word to be his enemy so long as I live." Queens were apparently no exception to this mandate. Charles expected his new wife to accept his affairs, and the couple entered into a marital fight that spilled over into the court. Charles ultimately won. He appointed Parma as a lady of the bedchamber to Catherine, blatantly ignoring the Queen's fierce objections. Catherine was so scandalized when Parma was presented to her that she passed out. Despite his frequent affairs, the failure to produce a legitimate heir, and the advice of others, Charles never attempted to divorce Catherine. Hortense Mancini may have had an affair with Charles's illegitimate daughter too. Roman-born Hortense Mancini, a niece of Cardinal Mazarin and member of the so-called Mazarinettes, was a short-lived mistress of Charles. But Charles wasn't the only member of his family with whom she had a romantic relationship. Mancini and Anne Leonard, Countess of Sussex, one of Charles' illegitimate children with Barbara Parma, may have had their own affair. When the teenaged, married Countess Sussex wanted to stay with Mancini rather than her husband, she was shipped off to a French convent. Mistresses often warred with one another and jockeyed for influence at court. Charles II lavished gifts on his mistresses. In other words, being a royal mistress was an incredibly lucrative business. His mistress Barbara Parma even had access to the privy purse, and he gamely settled her significant debts. Due to the power, wealth, and privilege that came with serving as a royal mistress, women often jockeyed with one another to win Charles's attention and affection. It is likely that Charles had up to 15 mistresses, along with the litany of casual dalliances he engaged in. It is impossible to know how many illegitimate children he had, but one would imagine it would be at least a dozen given his numerous conquests. One of the things Charles liked doing almost as much as sleeping with women was spending money. To say he was a lavish spender would be something of an understatement. When he became king in 1660, Parliament granted him an annual income of £1.2 million to run the government, a sum that should easily have been enough. But Charles contrived to overspend to an incredible degree. The actual revenue of the government was significantly lower than what Charles spent, so Parliament had to institute unpopular measures such as half tax to make up for the shortfall. Barbara was arguably the biggest spender in the entire kingdom. The king's mistress lived in beautiful palace apartments, and she gleefully accepted his expensive gifts. Not only that, but Charles almost wrote her a blank check by allowing her to take funds destined for the exchequer. For example, she received an estimated £25,000 a year, the equivalent of at least £3 million today, from beer tax, customs duties, and post office revenue alone, but that was the tip of the iceberg. One evening, Barbara reportedly lost £25,000 playing cards. Charles picked up the tab. Clearly, Charles didn't care about the people and was happy to spend at their expense. However, he foolishly didn't realize that a kingdom needs money for defense and expansion. Within a few years of becoming king, an event occurred that nearly destroyed Britain and claimed his crown. That's it for today. To support, please subscribe.